From our 22 News Broadcast Center, this is 22 News in Focus.
Good Sunday afternoon. Welcome to 22 News in Focus. I'm Tamara Sakarzik. We have recently learned about the suicides of designer Kate Spade and chef, author, and television host Anthony Bourdain. They may have looked like they had it all: successful businesses, wealth, and loving family and friends, but you can't always see the sadness that people may be experiencing on the inside. Today on 22 News in Focus, we'll be talking about suicide, including what causes someone to take their own life, the impact on survivors, and resources for people in need. During the course of this program, we'll display the National Suicide Prevention Hotline at the bottom of the screen for you. That number is 1-800-273-8255. Joining me today to talk more about the issues surrounding suicide are Melissa Rowan Decker, a licensed independent social worker and director of residential services for the Mental Health Association, and Jennifer Molina, a clinical director, licensed mental health clinician, and alcohol and drug counselor supervisor for the Mental Health Association. First, I'd like to talk to you both about your backgrounds. Why did you get into mental health?
Oh, that's a long story.
I was going to say, there's a story for everyone.
Yeah, my interest began really in high school when I started working at a summer camp for youth with chronic physical health conditions, and realized the importance of being available as a support to youth, and that carried forward in, working in youth programs for the next 20 years. And now I work with adults with chronic mental illness and young adults, and love it.
Kind of a similar story. I was a camp counselor as well, and I also, through my church, did a lot of Habitat for Humanity. We did a lot of outreach to the homeless population, and so it kind of just began this want to help people, and it just evolved into going to college for that and getting involved in different outreach and residential programming until I went back to school.
Well, it's good thing that you're both in mental health, because this is clearly an issue that affects so many people across the world and here in Western Massachusetts. And I know that there is a big difference between someone who is suicidal and someone who is depressed or maybe experiencing anxiety issues, something else. What's the definition clinically for someone who is suicidal?
Well, suicidal, feeling suicidal is an internal experience. It's a thought that someone is having. And so it's really important not to look just at behavior and mood as an indicator, but to be asking someone that question, are they having thoughts of suicide? Are they feeling suicidal? It's a really important and really the best way to know.
Yeah, I think it's important to know that you don't have to have a diagnosis to be considered someone maybe who is having suicidal thoughts or ideas around that action.
And a lot of people who are depressed or experiencing something that may not be suicidal thoughts exactly, how can you really tell the difference about how someone's feeling just by, talking to them or observing their behaviors?
It's by talking to them, I think, and observing their behaviors.
You have to talk.
You have to sometimes ask those questions. Yeah. There's, when you're working in human services, there's a lot of times you might talk around issues and stuff, but when it comes to suicidal thoughts, those are the questions you kind of just ask, sometimes straightforward. It's the best way to approach it, I think, sometimes is, are you thinking of, have you had thoughts of, and then you proceed from there with a series of questions. But it's a really direct, for me, a direct question I would ask if I suspected someone I'm working with might be feeling like that.
I provide a training that is for community members, and it's in teaching community members how to reach out to youth who may be experiencing a mental health crisis. And one of the things that we do as part of the training is we actually have a group of people sit around a table and practice asking the question, because you can think that you're ready to ask the question, but it's extremely hard to get those words out the first time. And so we practice asking this question of each other. We talk about what it feels like to hear the question being asked, and then we talk about the importance of being very clear and direct, not using euphemisms, not talking about, are you feeling depressed and do you feel like you want to hurt yourself? But if you're concerned about someone, if you think that they might be considering suicide, to be very direct and to say, are you thinking about killing yourself? Are you thinking about suicide?
And I love that you do that group activity because it is an awkward question to ask. So is that something that you would also recommend, that a parent or a friend or family member, that they kind of practice saying it before they actually ask the question?
I think it can help, certainly, with your confidence. The conversation is going to be difficult and challenging and emotional and hard and painful, especially if you care about the person that you're talking to. So there's just no way around that. But it's so vitally important. Not talking about your concern, you know, is what creates an opportunity for that person, because they don't know. They don't know that people are concerned about them. They don't know that people are worried until that person has a family member come to them. So it's really important to reach out, as hard, as painful as it can be.
Right. When it comes to different genders, would you say that women are generally more likely to say that something is wrong than men, or will both of them, you know, have the same expectation of saying that something's wrong if it is wrong when you ask?
I mean, when I was looking up some statistics recently, it said men are more likely to attempt suicide than women, but women are more likely to speak out about it if they have had a prior attempt. I don't, you know, in my experience, I do feel that women are more likely, I think, to share their past because there's maybe less stigma around it for women. With this idea of what a man is, it could be perceived maybe as weak or not as strong as another man when you look at some people's definition of that. And so it might be easier for women to express that based on that. So I believe that it might be easier for them to share and talk about it than probably a man would.
With the high-profile suicides that we've recently seen, Kate Spade, Anthony Bourdain, would you say that this kind of starts the conversation for many people, or is it kind of, you know, the same thing that it would have been if they didn't do this?
I think it's a double-edged sword. I think when a famous person kills themselves, it does bring media attention to it. It's in the news and it's a well-known name, and a lot of people might look up to this person, so it could bring attention to the awareness of suicide. I think on the other side of it, there could be a piece that after they've passed, there's this conversation around how wonderful they were and what they gave back to their community and how they're going to be remembered. And so my fear would be for someone who maybe isn't famous and isn't connected or feeling like really noticed in their community, that might be a perception of, after I pass, there might be some remembrance of who I am. So for me, I think it's double-edged. It provides an awareness, but it also makes me a little cautious as well.
There's definitely a need in schools to have a planful approach to not just deaths of people who are important in youth culture. In my generation, it was Kurt Cobain, but also deaths of students, because there will be a kind of memorialization that occurs, and in that process, students can feel like, you know, this student who felt ignored, marginalized, bullied in real life, look at all the attention that they get now. And I think that's the fear, that when we talk about people dying by suicide, that we are very careful to say that, you know, they were much more important when they were alive than they are now that they've passed, you know, and that it's really a tragedy when anybody is gone. It's not an opportunity to be noticed.
And you guys did mention statistics. Out of curiosity, how many people in the United States commit suicide every year? Do you know that?
The last statistic was 2016. I want to say it was 45,000.
Yeah.
In that range.
Yeah, one of the things I find very sad, but also very telling, is that we know that homicide rates have decreased since the year 2000, except in recent years. But there was a steady decrease in homicide rates over the course of more than a decade. We can't say the same thing for suicide. It's actually increased every single year since 2000. And one of the things that's concerning to me, having worked a lot with young people, is that we see suicide occurring in younger and younger ages. And we've had some young people in the Valley There was a 10-year-old who died by suicide as an impact of bullying in schools. I think ER staff are having to be prepared for younger people coming in who they never would have considered being at risk. There was a study that came out that showed that between 2008 and 2015, the amount of visits to ERs by young people for suicidal thinking or behavior and injury related to suicide more than tripled. So it's a problem that's getting worse, not better. And it's something that we need to take a very hard look at.
Okay, well, we'll talk much more about that when we come back. We'll also talk about suicide among children and teenagers. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Welcome back to 22 News in Focus. Today we're talking about suicide prevention. Now, you may remember that a few years ago, 2 suicide cases involving children in Western Massachusetts made national news. 15-year-old Phoebe Prince of South Hadley and 10-year-old Carl Walker Hoover of Springfield both took their lives because of bullying. Bullying, of course, is a major factor with suicides, especially among children and teenagers. What should parents and teachers be looking out for?
Well, I think the good news is there are ways that schools and parents can approach this that are highly effective, that we know can make a difference. And one is to have families and school administrators be focused on evaluating a student's emotional well-being in school, not just their academic performance. To be evaluating the overall school culture, because that's where you need to look at how prevalent is bullying in the school. Are there groups of kids that feel marginalized, that feel left out? So, that experience, that peer experience, is just as important for the student in a school as is the academic experience. So everybody needs to be paying attention to that. The other thing is that when school administrators are looking at their school population, they need to be identifying those youth that are at risk and reaching out to them and their families and having conversations. And then the final thing is schools need to be prepared. They need to have a response plan that helps students in the school understand, make sense of. We were just talking about a young boy that passed away locally at 9 years old, I believe. And there needs to be a response plan from schools. How are you going to help families and the students understand this? How are you going to help them recover from this experience? So there are things that can be done, and they do make a big difference.
Do you have anything to add to that?
I mean, adolescence is a really hard time as it is. Right. You're going through all sorts of developmental phases and cognitive changes, and so there's a longing to be connected, and you want to be accepted more than anything by your peers. I don't know if that changes over time, even into an adulthood, but especially when you're in elementary and junior high, high school age, you want to fit in. It's not always the time where you want to stand out and be different. And so if you are someone who's struggling, that already kind of struggling with any mental health, you already maybe stand out. Maybe you're someone who has to go to the special ed class or maybe pulled out, and so you're already getting attention from that, and that could put an easy target on your back as well. So look for the kids who do eat alone at lunch, or maybe on the playground kind of pulled away from a group, and just little things like that, because even though they might say, I'm fine, or I like hanging out alone, I do think it's a natural urge to want to be connected to your peers, and so you want to be accepted by groups in your school and after school. So kind of monitoring those things a little bit.
Yeah. And when I think of bullying and how much it has just progressed almost over the past decade or so, I mean, when I was younger, we had instant messaging and AOL, but we did not have the social media that people can now just hide behind a screen and attack you on. Do you think this has made things worse?
I think 100%. You can't hide from it, and you can't. Once it's in the internet, you can't take it down, no matter if, a certain Facebook, Instagram, whatever it is, takes it down. It's still out there. You can find it, and it gets to so many people so fast. So even if it gets taken down, so many people have already seen it. And I think, you know, with that, they're touching people in other schools. They're touching kids and adolescents and students that don't even go to your school, and maybe you went to an after-school club somewhere with other children, and now they know about whatever you're being bullied. It just spreads rapidly. And so where home used to be your safe place after school, or your friend's house, or you know, a sports team that used to be maybe your safe place because it was only happening in school or on the playground, it seems now you have no safe space to go to and be connected, and not the person who's being bullied.
Yeah. And bullying, I'm sure, also isn't the only thing that can drive a child or teenager to have suicidal thoughts.
No, there's a lot of factors in young people. It's true that children and adolescents, they're going through important developmental stages that require them to sort of manage a lot of developmental tasks. The end result is that they become adults who can take care of themselves and be independent in the world. But it takes a lot of hard work to get there, and it's a very challenging time. And one of the things I think it's important for parents to consider is that, first of all, most youth get through that developmental process and they pass through it with flying colors, and they become adults who can be independent in the world and safe and have loving, supportive relationships, you know, great jobs. But it's still a time of challenge, and you really need to pay attention to those youth who are struggling, and not to just sort of say, well, you know, that's what it means to be a teenager, or, you know, they got to figure it out on their own, because they can't always figure it out on their own. They want to try and figure it out on their own, but they really need grown-ups in their lives. They need school staff, they need parents who are involved, who are monitoring their social media, who are helping them sort of talk about and think about problems with friends, academic problems. One of the things that I had mentioned, that there was a study that showed that suicide-related visits to hospitals have increased among youth, and that same study found that those visits actually happen more often during the academic year than during the summer, and which is the opposite trend. Most suicides in adults occur, the highest rates are in the summertime. So the thinking behind that is that, you know, one is that children and teens are under a tremendous amount of performance stress in school. Related not just to academics, though, it's also their social groups. I mean, the social media piece cannot be underestimated, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a scary thing. We've already talked about technology. Is there, if a child is being bullied either in person or maybe online through technology, social media, things like that, is there a place that they can go to for help without getting their parents involved? Just thinking about the fact that some teenagers,
yeah,
you know, how they think.
Well, I think, you know, one of the things that youth hopefully are hearing within their schools is that that the school staff want to know. That they'll, you know, that doesn't mean they're going to run to every student in the school and say, Johnny, you know, said you're bullying. But guidance counselors want to know. You know, they want to know what the atmosphere is in the school, what the culture is of, you know, whether children experience the school as inclusive or divisive and segregated. So it's important to have adults in schools who can be a safe person for young people to go to and say, I'm really struggling here. You know, there are some groups of kids that are really tough. Don't need you to tell anybody, don't need you to run and put it on the intercom, you know, that I'm having a tough time, but I want you to know, and kind of someone that they can trust is gonna be paying close attention and trying to do something about that, affect some change.
Right, and when you think about it, one person really can make all the difference between, you know.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. We know that the #1 protective factor in preventing suicide is someone having one person that they trust talking to. That's by far,
absolutely,
you know, the biggest thing that you could do. So that's why we're out here. We want to talk to family and friends and say, you know, it could be you. It doesn't have to be a healthcare professional. It could be you. You could make the difference.
Right, and that's a very important message to know. Losing someone to suicide is one of the hardest things that many families will ever have to go through, of course, so we'll talk about that after the break. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Welcome back to 22 News in Focus. Today we're talking about suicide prevention and resources. It can be a challenging, confusing, and painful experience when a loved one takes their own life. Whether it's a family member, friend, or coworker, many people feel guilty that they didn't recognize the signs. So I'd like to start by talking about what are some of the signs that people should recognize.
Maybe withdrawing from an unusually really enjoyable activity that somebody used to be involved in, withdrawing from social groups and activities around close relationships. I don't think there's a typical prescription that this is what it looks like if your loved one is thinking of hurting themselves or contemplating suicide. But if there is any change in somebody's demeanor or typical mood or, you know, enjoying themselves, then I would just ask, hey, are you okay? How are you doing?
I was going to say with young people, there are some ways that you can get a sense of how a young person is thinking, because they often aren't willing to share their feelings openly with their families. So with young people, you can look at, are there themes of death or dying in the music that they're listening to, the art that they're producing, the writing that they're doing. If it seems to be that they're very focused on themes of death, then that's something that, you know, can be explored. The other thing I was going to say about young people is that sometimes young adult males don't necessarily look depressed or what we might think of as someone who would be contemplating suicide, depressed, hopeless, withdrawn. They might actually look very reckless. And so you have to pay attention to young men that are, you know, not just experimenting with drugs and alcohol, but drinking to the point of blackout, and they're doing it over and over and over again. And you know, a parent is probably going to be the last person to know that this is going on. So it's really important for other young people, if you have a concern about a friend of yours, if you see them engaging in behavior that has you worried, you should be worried and you should be talking to someone about it. I think sometimes we might tend to think of, you know, young men as boys will be boys. You know, they're more adventurous, they're more impulsive, they tend to be daredevils. But there's a level of risk-taking that if, you know, a young person is indicating that they just totally have no regard for their own safety, that needs to be looked at, because that could be an indicator that they're thinking about suicide.
And I can't even imagine how difficult it is for the family and friends of people who do commit suicide. What are some of the coping skills that you can use to get through something like that?
I think being around people that also knew this person and talking about the, you know, good times with them, expressing how they feel around it. Not being able to express that you feel sad or upset, because you're allowed to have your own feelings as well. I think a lot of people who have loved ones that have killed themselves often have this feeling of, if I only did this, if I had just that day asked one question. There's no way to predict if somebody that day is going to do something to themselves. And so the best you can to remind yourself that, you know, it isn't your fault, and that you know, you can't kind of go back and say, what if, or had I done this, because you might never get out of that. And those are a lot of questions that you might never have answers to, and so there's a lot of acceptance that has to follow, accepting that you did what you could while the person was here, but also that, you know, it's not your fault. I think that's the main thing to get people through, being around your, you know, whoever makes you happy, family or friends, and making sure you're staying involved in enjoyable activities as well, reaching out if you need to a professional to kind of talk through some of the unresolved feelings that you might have around it. And it's okay to be mad as well. You know, with grief comes different stages, and being angry is part of that.
I think one of the things that is really challenging for for mental health providers is to really look at what are we doing to educate community members about suicide, because without education, family members, people hear that there are warning signs, and so family members may be sort of beating themselves up saying, why didn't I notice, why didn't I pay attention? But the fact is there's not education that's happening nationally on a regular basis to help family members understand those warning signs. It's not happening in pediatrician or doctor's offices. It's not happening in schools. So I think there's really a lot of responsibility on the experts, the mental health providers, to look at what can we do to get information out there to community members so that they do know what to look for and can be paying attention.
I think also too, not to stop asking if somebody's okay when they are looking or you think they're doing better. A lot of times people think in the really saddest moments and depressed moments, and that's when someone might harm themselves, and that's not always the case either. They could look refreshed and doing well, and things seem to be falling into place for this person after a long struggle, and so we might stop asking if they're okay and how they're doing and checking in. And in a lot of folks, statistics show that they harm themselves when they kind of have the more energy to do it, when things are looking better and they're kind of out of the real low of it. And so just to not stop asking if someone has struggled and is looking like they're doing really well.
Yeah, just because someone looks okay doesn't necessarily mean they are okay. And I mean, Anthony Bourdain was the perfect example of that. So that's, a high-profile person that.
Yeah,
exactly.
Recently there was a musician, there was a video of him, his family released prior to him hurting himself, and he was playing with his kids and having a great time and smiling and laughing. And so, there's not always going to be that, what we think it looks like.
And I know that in Western Massachusetts, we're obviously struggling with a major crisis with the opioid epidemic. Do you think there's a correlation between substance abuse disorders and people who take their own lives at all?
Well, there are people who engage in reckless behavior, like I had mentioned, a young person who's experimenting with drugs and alcohol, but to the point where they're binge drinking to blackout. That is an indicator, perhaps, that that really the substance use is less about a substance use disorder and more about a way of drowning out their sorrows, of really tuning out and maybe trying to do that, by death. So it's something that should really be looked at. I mean, there are people who develop an addiction and a substance use disorder, but they don't want to die. They have no desire to die. And then there are people who really the substance is a mechanism to get them to that place where they can no longer be here. And so that level of assessment probably requires a specialized mental health clinician to really tease that out. Regardless, if you have someone in your life who's using substances, it's a conversation, about, hey, what are you doing? What does this mean? Do you need help? Those are important questions to be asking.
And besides, there's obviously accidental overdose when it comes to opiate use that, you don't always know if it was suicide or accidental, but also I think the same thing I was just saying, when people are newly in recovery and sober and doing well, a lot of times they're now dealing with the stuff that happened while they were using, and shameful things that maybe have happened, and embarrassment, and whatever they were covering up in the first place is emerging too. So that's like another time to be like a little bit more focused on that person and checking in and asking, and having, if they're working with a therapist, and really focus on that time. And early recovery can be fantastic because you're feeling probably better physically, emotionally a little bit, but you're also dealing with a new or already pre-existing set of struggles that were happening prior to using.
And especially for parents, if your child or teenager ends up committing suicide, I know that for anyone who's really experiencing any type of death, but especially suicide, that once you do eventually feel happy again, do these people ever feel guilty that they feel happy, even if it's, months or years later?
Yeah, well, I think Jen touched on, the grief process is complicated, and people are often shocked that at some point in the grief process they feel relief But when you have someone that has been in your life, and maybe it's been a chronic medical condition that's been a struggle, relief can be part of the experience, but people don't understand that that's not uncommon. It doesn't make them a bad person. It's a very normal reaction to a very tough situation. So I think one of the things is, people oftentimes talk about really needing the support of people who've gone through similar experiences. And luckily for people who have experienced suicidal thinking, there are peer groups. So, there are people with lived experience who can talk about what it was like, how they recovered, what got them through, and that can create a real sense of belonging and hope for people. So there are those resources locally.
And speaking of that, if you or someone you know could be suicidal, as you just mentioned, there is help. So we'll tell you more about that after a short break. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Welcome back to 22 News in Focus. Today we've been talking about suicide prevention. Let's talk about resources for people who may be suicidal or someone who knows someone who could be suicidal. Do you think that the stigma around suicide prevents people from seeking help at all?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would say having to reach out to somebody, in particularly a mental health counselor or someone in that field. There's this stigma around, this term, they're crazy, or that, they're not like everybody else, or that means something bigger could happen. And a lot of times people think if they go to a mental health counselor and share what they're feeling, does that mean they're going to get put on meds or be hospitalized or something, where it could just be a conversation. And a lot of us in the mental health field and social workers and therapists will have those conversations and be able to hear those difficult things. I think also if you were to, go to your friend, you might feel like, well, if they tell my parents, I'm going to get in trouble, or, a younger person might feel that way. So I think there's this stigma and these language and these heavy words that a lot of people throw around, and that people are embarrassed to have that be their label or become who they are.
I think people, especially with suicide perhaps, may believe that it's the kind of thing that's gonna get them locked up, that they're going to be placed in a hospital someplace, that they're never going to be able to leave. And unfortunately, we don't often see in the media, we don't often see the other side of suicide, which is that most people who experience suicidal thinking, they recover. They live full, productive, meaningful lives. And unfortunately, what gets attention a lot of times are the deaths by suicide. Not the people who thought about it but got some support, or who attempted but thankfully made it through and found a way to recover and flourish. That's much more often the reality.
Absolutely.
People recover. It really isn't a death sentence. It's something you can live a full life. You can share your story with other people and make a difference. And the great thing is there are people nationally who are doing that. They're trying to get their story out there and be role models, especially to young people, that it's not a hopeless situation.
Yeah, and it's not uncommon. It doesn't matter age, race, gender, where you work, who you are in life. Having thoughts of suicide is a really common experience.
Yes.
I think it's just not talked about because of that stigma.
I'm sure that if you did ask people, if at some point in your life did you ever think of or consider that years later, they'd probably be much more open about it.
Yes, yeah. Most people experience it as a fleeting thought, but it is common.
And when it comes to preventing suicide, obviously the most important thing is to get the resources, get the help that you need. So where can people find the clinicians, the psychiatrists, the people that they need to talk about this with?
I mean, here in Western Mass, there's many agencies that have clinics and have those services. I mean, you could literally Google it and there will be a bunch of them that come up. But if you're at a physical, your primary care doctor could direct you in the right direction. If you're not comfortable telling anyone and you just say to your primary care, I'm really looking to talk to a therapist, they will, you know, give you a list of resources. You can call your insurance company if you have insurance, and they'll give you a list of resources. But again, the guidance counselors, going to a good friend, if someone has a spiritual, religious person they want to go to, there are resources out there that are not always just traditional as well. But to get traditional mental health counseling in Western Mass is easy. You just ask, and we're all over. The agencies are all over Western Mass.
And you have the hotline, which is available 24/7 and is a resource to talk to someone. But there are also peer support phone numbers. There's a peer support organization locally. So if a person isn't necessarily comfortable going to a professional, you know, they want to be talking to someone who they don't have to worry will diagnose them with a mental health condition. There's a local agency, the Recovery Learning Center. They run a warm line that is peer run, and folks can call in the evenings and talk to someone who has lived experience. So there's a lot out there that's available for people.
I know you mentioned calling your health insurance, but what if you don't have health insurance but you want to talk to, you know, a professional, not a peer group? Is there an option for you?
You can always call. There's local crisis numbers along with the recovery learning community. There's local crisis numbers that are available for, you know, Springfield, Westfield, cluster areas. That's free. You can call and just talk to someone on the phone. You don't even have to identify your name. There's a counselor on the other end. Or you, if you're really at need and feel like you need to have a face-to-face assessment, they can come out and assess you as well. And again, if you don't have insurance but you were at an emergency department or anything like that, they would also help you out there regardless of insurance. And there's also the other options that we were just talking about as well. That shouldn't be a barrier.
No. And for young people, any youth in Massachusetts who is Mass Health eligible, so they don't even need to be enrolled, but if a youth and their family, if they're Mass Health eligible, there's an array of services through the Children's Behavioral Health Initiative that's available to these youth, and it was created in part to provide services to youth in their communities. So there are in-home therapists, there's in-home behavioral supports for family members, there's something called a therapeutic mentor, which is like a one-on-one who can work with the youth to develop coping skills. So these are for all Mass Health eligible residents in Massachusetts and for children. So they're a great resource, and you can Google it, the Children's Behavioral Health Initiative.
And if you do have these issues and you do start seeing someone professionally to deal with it, when or do they tell you if there's a point that you should stop, that that they think you're out of the woods, or are you ever really completely out of the woods?
That's a really individualized,
loaded question.
Well, individualized conversation, and it's really individual to the person too. Even if you have two clients same age and same background, and they're still going to be very different. Resilience is different. What is causing some of the thoughts are different. Maybe someone has more intense trauma background, and so that's going to be up to the person receiving the services and the therapist to kind of have that conversation as you get there. But as long as you're wanting to engage in the process, they will work with you. And even if therapy ends, there's no reason you can never go back. And so, life kind of ebbs and flows. So you might be doing well, and then later on be like, I really want to go back and talk. I'm having those same feelings. But that really is, there's no prescription that says,
after 6 months.
After 6 months, you have to leave and hope everything is tied up in a bow. Also, employees that are working somewhere, there's an employee assistance program too as well. Every agency has an employee assistance program for folks as well. But yeah, I don't know the day I do an intake with somebody, the day that they're going to be done.
Right, it's not that simple.
And I think too that I think of, I like to think of mental health in the same way that I think of my physical health, that I'm sort of constantly engaged in thinking about how I can be physically healthy. I'm kind of constantly engaged in thinking about how I can be mentally healthy as well. So it's an ongoing, lifelong process.
All right. Well, the Mental Health Association offers plenty of other resources as well, so we'll tell you much more about that after the break. You're watching 22 News in Focus. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Today we've been talking about suicide prevention and supportive resources, but the Mental Health Association also provides many services for people living with mental illnesses, developmental disabilities, substance abuse, and even homelessness. What other types of mental health issues can this organization help with?
So we actually have two major divisions. We have the Division of Recovery and Housing, which provides residential services and outreach services to folks that have mental health struggles. And under that division, we also have some homeless outreach and Housing First programs, as well as a tenancy preservation program, which helps maintain people in housing that might be going to housing court. Housing First is basically what it is. You get housing first, and then we work on if it's your substance abuse or other mental health struggles after. Kind of important to have that safety piece first of shelter and a place to live. We also have the Division of Developmental Disabilities, and those we have residential services there as well, and we have outreach services for folks that are living in their apartments and they're supported. We also have shared living. And our folks live with a provider, and they share their home with them, and it, you know, another style of independence. We are opening and have opened several brain injury programs as well. Those are for people that are coming out of nursing homes that have an acquired brain injury and don't really fit the nursing home model because they are much more independent, and there was no place in Massachusetts for them to live, and so there was a lawsuit that happened in funding, and it came about, and now we're opening these really amazing brain injury programs as well. We do, for the most part, have a closed referral system from the Department of Mental Health, Department of Children and Families, and Department of Developmental Services.
And how about other developmental disabilities?
Those are the brain injury programs, and then we have DDS residential and outreach. So it could be something that they were born with, or a cognitive or developmental delay, intellectual disability. And again, they live in residential homes that are staffed 24/7, and they're all at varying levels of independent skills. So some of our folks work or have a bowling league, or are out in the community going to church and doing things. Some folks are a little bit more medically compromised, so we have a nursing staff on both divisions that kind of help support them in their homes so that they can live maybe away from their families and things like that most people like to do once they've reached that age.
Who decides whether someone is the perfect candidate for inpatient or outpatient? Is that like a group decision, something that you guys decide, or something that the patient themselves decide?
So it's not really inpatient. That would be more of a hospital setting, or outpatient would be like receiving individual therapy at a clinic. A residential program, the old term is like a group home. So we get referrals from the state basically because they've qualified for these services, and we kind of read them as a team along with the state, support workers, and our team saying, would this be a great fit for this residential program? Who else lives in the house? You kind of want people to get along as best as you can, and it is a great, a good setting for them to build their skill in. On the Division of Recovery and Housing, we get referrals mostly from the Department of Mental Health. Some people are coming out of long-term hospitalizations, so they've maybe been in a hospital for quite some time, and so it's a slow process to kind of reintegrate back into the community and get yourself back, doing things you enjoy, and again, going out into the community. Things like that, providing rehab.
One important thing about our residential programs that I think a lot of people may not be aware of is that the goal is really either rehabilitation that allows someone to return to a level of functioning that they had previously, or skill building. And ultimately, both of those are meant to allow a person to live as independently as possible. So we have programs that are meant to be transition programs. They're meant to be temporary. The people come in, they live in the program for a year, 2 years, 3 years, build some skills that they need, and successfully move out of our 24-hour residential programs into their own apartment, or a community setting where they have just a little bit of outreach every once in a while. So it's not that all 24-hour residential programs are kind of permanent, long-term, in that place and never going to move anyplace else. I mean, we do have people that are probably going to stay in their homes for most of their life, but we have a lot of programs that are really about graduating. Especially, we have 2 programs that are young people are referred from DCF, and those programs are really about providing some structure for those young people to gain some skills, and then hopefully when they turn 22, 21, they move into their own apartment. They know how to balance a checkbook, and
Cook,
they have a job. They
shop.
can take care of their apartment. Yeah.
So they also teach, other skills while you're staying at these.
Yeah, I mean, a big part of what we focus on is helping people understand their mental health needs and develop their own plan for how they're going to manage their mental health. But there are also very practical skills that are needed for people to live independently. They have to know how to cook, they have to know how to pay bills. So we do a lot of that too.
And where are these places located? Throughout the Pioneer Valley, or?
For the most part, Springfield. We have a couple in Chicopee, one in Westfield. We just have some in Ludlow recently, the acquired brain injury programs. We opened 2 in Ludlow, or opening 2 in Ludlow. So throughout,
The Springfield area, East Longmeadow,
So there's a lot of them.
Yeah.
And is there a wait list for any of these, or are you pretty much always accepting new patients?
There tends to be a wait for some folks because of, if we have a 4-bedroom home, there's 4 folks in it. And so because it's a closed referral system from the state, there tends to be a wait for folks to get into a residential program. But sometimes they go to other agencies as well if our residentials are filled.
If there is a wait, would you recommend going to a different agency, or does it depend on, how long the wait is?
It kind of depends on the needs of the person and what programs are available. So if one of our programs didn't match the needs and had an opening, they might go to another agency as well. Yeah, they would work with their state provider to kind of figure out what's available and what's best. But a lot of times folks have to wait sometimes,
And the brain injury program, I think that's very interesting. Can you just talk a little bit about how that specifically helps people who are suffering from a brain injury?
Sure. So it's a little bit different than the traditional DDS model, in the sense that they've acquired a brain injury. There's traumatic brain injuries and acquired brain injuries. Traumatic brain injuries are more something of an impact, or something that was to happen to you. This is how I describe it from the outside: a car accident, fall, a slip and fall. Acquired brain injury could be some internal, a stroke, a seizure that was caused in suffered a brain injury. And what happened was they might have pre-existing mental health stuff going on and already some other issues. So they might lose a level of independence or skill that they previously had. So, they were, going to work every day, doing what they normally do, and something happened that they acquired this brain injury.
So this program will get them back to
We'll put them back there, yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll have the last word for you after the break. Stay with us. You're watching 22 News in Focus. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Today we've been talking about suicide prevention and resources, as well as the many programs offered by the Mental Health Association. That's our program for today. We want to thank our guests for joining us, and thank you at home for watching. If you missed any of it, you can watch it in full on our website at wwlp.com, where you can also find links to mental health resources. From all of us here at 22 News, we hope you have a wonderful Sunday. Bye.